Kia ora koutou. My name is Marek Tesar and I'm chairing the RECE steering committee. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our first Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education RECE 30th anniversary webinar titled What Should Matter in Early Childhood Care and Education Today? Critical Conversations. I would like to acknowledge all the Indigenous people on whose land we are connecting today to this webinar. We also want to acknowledge our teachers, families, and children who are affected by the pandemic around the world, many of whom are struggling during the current outbreaks and lockdowns. The Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education organization is focused on a critical approach to early childhood education, theories, and childhood studies. We also focus on scholarship and activism, and as an organization, we share a concern about privileging particular sets of beliefs or knowledges that can create power for certain groups of people and oppress others. RECE is a broad and welcoming international organization, and on behalf of the RECE steering committee, I would like to welcome you all to join us by visiting our website, receinternational.org, and becoming active members. 30 years, that's how long has passed since the very first RECE conference in Madison. Today's webinar marks the start of the year of celebrating RECE's 30th anniversary. There will be 2 further webinars in November and January, and celebrations will culminate next year with a hybrid conference. Details to follow soon. Become members today to get the latest information and updates, and we are using this year hashtag RECE30. It's my great privilege to acknowledge and deeply thank the organizers of today's webinar, Lacey Peters, Rachel Langford, and Mimi Bloch. My thanks also to the 30th Anniversary Planning Committee, Sonia Arndt, Jonathan Sillen, Margarita Ruiz Guerrero, Beth Bruce Swadener, Bobby Zayman, and Matthias Urban. RECE also thanks the School of Social Transformation and Arizona State University for the technical support of this event, especially the event coordinator, Jeannie Colcat. And please stay tuned, become members of RECE, become involved, and support our vibrant community. You will be the first to know about our future events during the 2021 and 2022 hybrid conference. With that, I would like to introduce today's webinar chair and moderator, Professor Gail Bold. Gail is not only a long-standing colleague, a great scholar and thinker, and RECE member, but Gail is also the most recent recipient of RECE's Block Life Achievement Award, which was awarded at our last conference in New Mexico in 2019. She is a professor in curriculum and instruction at Penn State University, teaching undergraduate courses in literacy education and PhD seminars in theory and philosophy as they relate to contemporary issues in education. She is the senior editor of the Bank Street Occasional Paper Series, and I think the new issue is just out now. And she is also a psychotherapist offering play therapy in a community mental health setting. So Namahi Nui and Gail, over to you to introduce us to today's theme and speakers. Kia ora.
Thanks, Mark. I don't see myself, so I don't know if you hear me. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Mark. And I want to welcome everyone to RECE's 30th anniversary webinar series. I want to thank the steering committee for all the hard work of organizing the webinar and for inviting me and the panelists to participate in tonight's event. Meaning the panelists and I, drew from the title of the event, which is What Should Matter in Early Childhood Education, Critical Conversations, to conceptualize our task as laying a broad international groundwork about the issues that are critical to the field right now, 30 years on from the founding of the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education group. So how we're going to proceed tonight is this. I'm going to start with a few remarks about the issues in the field of early childhood education that mattered to the founders of RECE when the group first met 30 years ago in 1991. I'm then going to introduce the panelists, and they are going to take a few minutes each to answer the question, what do you think should matter now, 30 years on in the field of early childhood education? We would treat these opening remarks as invitations to dig more deeply, and the panelists will then undertake an improvisational discussion in response to their opening comments. That conversation amongst the panelists will last until the top of the hour, whatever the top of the hour might mean for you. We are about to, or we have, I'm not sure, turn the chat off. And instead the Q&A function will be opened, or will be soon. During the panelists' conversation, you are welcome to add questions to the Q&A. At the top of the hour, we will turn to the audience questions in the Q&A, and I will invite individual audience members to turn on your mic and camera and to address the panel. This will go on for about 25 minutes, and then the event will close out with Mimi Block making an announcement. So my own participation in RECE began in 1993 as a first-year doctoral student at the University of Hawaii, working with Joe Tobin. But as I was thinking about tonight, and rather than depending on my sense of the issues that were most pressing when to those who started the group, I emailed the four of the founding members, Joe Tobin, Jonathan Sillin, Mimi Block, and Beth Sweidner, to ask what they thought mattered about the field at the time they got together for that first conference. The responses were quite similar, with 4 critical issues that they all identified. The first was the critical importance of challenging the staid and culturally biased heteronormative white Western theories of child development that dominated mainstream early childhood education research and publications. The state of the art in mainstream ECE was expressed at that time as developmentally appropriate practice, which served to provide guidance for families, physicians, and educators of young children ages 0 to 8. A key concern for the group's founders, many of whom were trained in educational and cultural anthropology and who were experienced in international and comparative research, was how DAP contributed to the minoritization and pathologization of children, their families, and communities, both in the US and abroad. Early in the RECE history, it felt critical to both recognize the lived realities of many children, including the presence of AIDS, racism, and poverty, to reject the persistent deficit framings of children and families viewed as at risk for failure, and to emphasize funds of knowledge, asset-based analyses, and socio-cultural, political, historical nature of childhood. A second critical issue was to reinvent early childhood education as a field that acknowledged the importance of interdisciplinary knowledge, such as philosophy, social theory, history, political, economic, social, and anthropological studies of young children, communities, families, and education. It was difficult, if not possible, during that era to find academic venues that welcomed the rethinking of childhood through queer theory, post-structural theory, post-colonial theory, feminist theory, indigenous theory, and other critical work that many were doing at that time. A third critical issue related to methodologies. Many members of the RECE group were among the first to do critical ethnography, video cued focus groups, personal critical narrative, and other methods. The interest in different types of qualitative and ethnographic work, which emerged in the US at least during the 1980s through the Reconceptualizing curriculum movement, was little appreciated or accepted in the dominant venues in which ECE, which still focused on these ideas of gold standard, positivist, or perhaps mixed methods research as being what they saw as the most valid or valuable. It mattered because of the recognition that research methods can either confirm normative paradigms, assumptions, and practices, or methods can participate in critiquing normativities and highlighting the power of difference. And finally, it was important for policy and practice to find ways to have these critical perspectives disseminated through the training of pre-service teachers and graduate students, publications in a variety of venues, access to presentation forums, and through the power to impact policy. The greatest growth of RECE over the past 30 years has been its expansion from a small group of American academics to becoming a vibrant international community of scholars. As a group, we have continued to critique, expand, and reimagine and reinvent both RECE and the field of early childhood education. And much of this has come through the work of participants from across the globe, including our 5 panelists, who I'm now going to introduce. So for this evening, our 5 panelists are Veronica Piscini-Ketchabal from Western University in Ontario, Canada, Yifeng Li at the University of Newcastle in Australia, Mary Scarrett from Te Herangawaka, University of Wellington, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Aisha Rabadi Raul at Sonoma State University in California in the US, and Marcela Montserrat Fonseca Bustos at the Oslo Metropolitan University in Norway. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Veronica with our first question, which is, what do you think matters now in the field of early childhood education?
Thank you very much, Gail, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure to join this panel with colleagues who I certainly admire. And I am joining you today from the traditional territory of the Chana and the Timbuktu people in what we now call South America. The question that Gail poses to us is a fantastic and an important one. There are many ways of engaging with this question, and I'm sure that all of us will come to it from a different perspective. But today I have chosen to highlight some of the work that I have done with my colleagues in the Commonwealth Research Collective. We live in a critical moment of epochal transition from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, or literally the age of man, in which human forces have fundamentally altered the planet's geobiospheric systems, triggering a cascade of ecological crises and threatening the future of life on Earth as we have known it, including that of our own species. Without the will to redress the root causes of the Anthropocene, we're now suffering the tragic consequences. We believe that first and foremost, this is indicative of our failure to imagine alternative ways of living with the Earth. Early childhood education is directly implicated in the crisis of the Anthropocene and our failure to reimagine alternatives. We need a fundamental break with humanist education, new or not, shifting from promoting humanism to exercising an ecological consciousness, from working to for social justice to also working for ecological justice, from understanding humans as social beings to understanding humans as ecological beings, from upholding exclusive human agency to recognizing agentic more than human relations, from encouraging individual development to fostering collective dispositions, from understanding teaching and learning as an exclusively human activity to approaching worldly relations as inherently pedagogical, from teaching students as subjects about the world as objects to learning with others in our worlds, from assuming universal positions and standards to considering pluriversal perspectives, from promoting human cosmopolitanism to understanding more than human cosmopolitics, from fostering human environmental stewardship to participating in more than human collective recuperative ethics. And I can go on and on and on. But we are convinced that the most profound challenge to making these shifts is extracting early education from the Cartesian divides that structure its established humanist knowledge, traditions, and pedagogies. These divides ensure that we not only ever learn about the world from a safe and privileged transcendence distance, they reinforce that an exteriorized world is out there, separate from us, as passively awaiting to be discovered and managed by us. In other words, the divides dissociate us from our sense of ecological being and belonging. They block our capacity to go on. And I'll stop there for my 3 minutes. Thank you.
Yifong, would you like to? Thank you, Veronica.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this great opportunity to reflect on my journey with the RECE community. So my own participation in RECE really began in around year 2000 when I was a first year doctoral student working with Mimi Block at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So to me, I think RECE is a community that has created a unique space for me to support and push me to think against the dominant discourse and ask critical questions. So to reflect on today's theme on what should matter in early childhood education and care, I trace back to the groups of dots and nuts that I have played with as a way to make a messy map to remember my initial questions, as well as to rethink how these questions have or have not changed. So the first nut that matters to me in early child education and care is the construction of the normal child and the ideal childhood. In the space of early childhood education settings, I'm deeply troubled by the outcome-based learning frameworks or national curriculum documents that make miniature students. So by miniature students, I mean children as young as 2-month-old can become a student that's learning, or as young as the first day that they were born, can become students learning something that are prescribed for them. So these types of documents are highly politicized to mobilize through neoliberal system of reasoning to sustain a narrowed until epistemological understanding about children and childhoods. So children's ways of being and becoming is prescribed and standardized. The making of miniature students in contemporary early childhood settings is quite dangerous. By constructing or making children as miniature students, it reduces our understanding of the multiplicities in social and cultural experiences and replace the diverse childhoods into a singular notion of studenthood. Studenthood, to me, is about learning and achieving or meeting learning outcomes. So the concept of miniature studenthood dangerously promotes a normal and ideal childhood as learning is emphasized. So that's the first group of nuts that kind of is presenting a pressing issue for me. And there is a second group of nuts or dots for me in early childhood that is relating to the social and educational reform policies nowadays. How these policies are reflecting problematic dominant discourses to further marginalize the already disadvantaged by remaking a dangerous but hegemonic way of understanding equality and equity. So for example, I'm troubled by an ongoing tokenistic construction of inclusion and diversity in early childhood settings. To me, I think it is important to see inclusion and exclusion as two sides of a coin that coexist. So if we are going to coin with the term inclusion and diversity in early childhood in our practice and policies, we cannot ignore the layers of macro and micro politics that are at work. So for me, I think these are the dots and nuts that are pressing issues and also have enabled me to ask questions to address the concerns in early child education and care settings. So I'll stop here. I think for me, I'm aware of the limits of the notions about answers and solutions as we are living in a complex world in these paradoxical moments of time. So without saying with troubles, we won't be able to ask questions which encourage us to challenge the dominant discourse and continue to think and rethink.
Thank you. Mary?
Unmuted. Mai. No mai, haere mai koutou ki tēnei ngā manuhiri, ki tēnei ona wānanga. And thank you all for being here today. What an honour and a pleasure. So what matters to me now, and I've done a bit like Ifang and gone backwards and forwards in time, but at the level of practice in early childhood education in terms of our Indigenous languages, like what's going on. So what are the ideas at play, whose ideas, and how are they being transported into policy and practice? And what's the Crown up to now? So we have a way of speaking in New Zealand about the Crown, which is a hangover from British colonialism, but it's a quasi-government state name. And it's really just another tribe, if you ask me. But we do give that Crown so much power and energy. And I'm thinking, you know, one of our little bits of activism that we should do is roll up to Parliament Hall wearing a crown. But seriously, now more than ever, it highlights the need to maintain the pedagogies of vigilance because of the deep-rootedness of colonialism in our country. And also maintain that critical vigilance in terms of the adequacy of or inadequacy of conceptual resources that inform policy and programs for children. How those developmental discourses or the taken for granted just want to hang around, especially in the educational psychology field. You know, that Cartesian divide that Veronica was talking about, and somehow the notion that life really starts from the birth date, and that sort of invisibilizes a whole lot of ancestral ways of knowing and being in the current times that we're in. But if we're really concerned about education as how it operates as a crucial site of power now more than ever, then of course we have to take those pedagogical functions both at the local level and the global levels to not only challenge the ways in which power is deployed or affirmed, but how we can continue to resist, which has always been our kaupapa in RECE. Back in the early days of Te Whāriki, we were buoyed into thinking things were looking pretty good here in Aotearoa. Te Whāriki is our curriculum document. ECE was gaining traction. Back then, rights discourses abounded because, of course, in 1989, we saw in the Convention of the Rights of the Child, and it came into force in 1990, and that was a significant year for Aotearoa, 150 years on from signing the treaty with the British Queen. But at the time, we were still reeling from the violence of the Springbok tour protests of the early 80s, which polarised our lands. And so by the end of the decade, we were looking for ways of being friendly towards one another. So Kohanga Reo was thriving. That's our Māori language nests were thriving in that time. Fast forward a little over a quarter of a century down the track in a very heavily regulated ECE environment, which has actually contributed in part to the demise of Kohanga Reo, or our language nests. So I'm not too sure how far we've come. We've different rights discourses around Indigenous peoples, around trying to figure out what that might mean with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, trying to operationalise those and what that might mean for young children in our centres. And in some ways, the much touted bicultural document Te Whāriki masks the inadequate conceptual resources that informed it, actually, especially around multilingualism and languages teaching and learning and advancement. So importantly, it fails to deal, this is Te Whāriki, fails to deal with the real issue in terms of the role of te reo Māori in the curriculum. It kind of pussyfoots around the real theoretical conceptualisation that needs to happen and what teachers ought to be focusing on for children in their whānau, like the issues of social justice and ecological justice for people and papatūānuku. So in short, I have three things, pedagogical functions, and being vigilant, when it comes to Homo sapiens, there's nothing natural in this world. And hasn't technology, we're getting into the algorithms, brain hacking and all the rest of it, that's shifted exponentially in the last 30 years. Curriculum ideologies, like who and what is being privileged, so the ideas that are underpinning our curriculum, and also operationalising rights, not only people rights, but the rights of our rivers and our lands. We now have, legislation in place that gives personhood rights to our rivers, two of them anyway, in New Zealand. But yeah, are the things on top for me currently. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou.
Thank you, Mary. Aisha?
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everyone. And thanks to the RECE community and committee for having me on this panel. I'm super excited to be here. So when I think about what should matter in early childhood, I think of three things. Firstly, the classroom community that includes the children, the teachers, the families, and the communities within which the school is situated. It's imperative to be equitable and just that we think about teachers, especially teachers of color, as valuable in ECE. By teachers of color, I mean racially, ethnically, linguistically, and culturally diverse teachers from non-dominant backgrounds. We all know that classrooms in North America and in so many parts of the world are increasingly diverse, but our workforce remains increasingly either white, middle class, monolingual, basically dominant. Teacher identity and teacher mindset are so important to set the tone for how the classroom functions. Secondly, what should matter, in my opinion, in ECE is the relationships between the people in the classroom community. We all know the importance of trusting relationships with the children and the grown-ups in our classroom community and how we need to be culturally relevant, responsive, and culturally sustaining. We cannot claim to care for our children if we don't care for the teachers and their families, the children's families. Finally, I believe that research, especially qualitative research, should matter in ECE. As a field, we can learn so much from each other's experiences and stories to gain different perspectives towards pedagogy and practice. We need to think about how we can disseminate this powerful research that I know many of you on this forum are doing directly to the teachers and educators in classrooms and not just have it contained within academia. So we really need to put our minds towards this and think about this. The pandemic has shown us that early childhood care and education is an essential service, which again, we all already knew. We are here for the children. Let's be honest, nobody joins this profession for the fame and fortune. We know what matters. My question is, what are we going to do about it? How do we take actionable steps towards what matters to make the changes that we need? Okay, I think mine was short and sweet. Thank you.
Thanks, Aisha. Michelle, that's up to you.
Thank you, Gail. First of all, I want to thank for this invitation. I'm really humble and proud to be part of this fantastic panel. I want to thank the organizer as well. And I want to thank you all for joining here today, or tonight, Norwegian time. I'm really humble and proud to be invited into all of your discussions and reflections around critical issues in early childhood today. I was introduced to the RECE community in Madison 2005 by Dr. Jeanette Redding Jones, who was my supervisor, mentor, and academic mother. Through her, I was introduced to critical perspectives on early childhood, and I bring with me her spirit and inspiration to these conversations here tonight. The issues that I think are critical in the field right now, they are that I think that we still need to deconstruct notions about the universal child, the white child, the modern child, the heteronormative child, the middle-class child, the monolingual child, the happy child, the child as a learner, the able-bodied child. I think we need to rethink children and childhoods to construct inclusive ECE institutions based on social justice, where every child matters. I also think that we need to critically engage with the global and the local. And the global, as Jeanette Redding Jones would have said, and how these global lives intersect with childhood and early childhood education. Children live their lives in local spaces, but Skyping with families all over the world, and they are inspired by the world. The last issue I want to highlight now in this first part of our conversation is the role of the early childhood teacher and early childhood researcher. We need to be brave, and we need to speak up on behalf of children in the early childhood education and care field. We need to build culture and support each other in advocating for children's rights and for social justice in early childhood. That's an ongoing struggle, and in many ways it looks the same as it did 30 years ago, but still it's different, same and different at the same time today, also and going forward. And we need to be, as a collective, we need to support each other and bring issues related to children and childhood to the conversations about early childhood. And we need to be brave doing that. We need to ask the questions that need to be asked, even though that we're uncomfortable doing that, because it's important that we move forward together with social justice as the way to go. So thank you. That was what I wanted to start with here now.
Thank you, Marcella. So this is the comments of our panelists, and when we met to plan this event, we decided that we had the capacity and the passion to just improvise a conversation now based on what just happened. I guess I'll throw out something that is very striking to me and see if you all want to follow up or not. And I think Veronica's opening statement is really about the future survivability of the planet. And I guess I am quite interested then. And I think there were lots of related topics then. Yifong bringing up the idea of the normal child, the ideal child, Mary bringing up the idea of the need for vigilance, and so on. Do you see connections between our role, our lives as early childhood educators and the futures of the planet? I know Veronica brought that up, but do you see connections between what you were saying and this huge need in neoliberalism and capitalism and this huge need for the planet to survive, for us to survive? I should say for us to survive on the planet. I think the planet will be fine without us and probably better off without us, but the survival of humans on the planet. I was just so moved by what Veronica said. I thought I would throw that out as an open prompt.
Can I just respond there, Gail? It's really interesting on that one, because there's a case fresh out of Australia, and if I could beg your indulgence here, I'll just read it really quickly. It's so difficult to characterise. This is the judge, the summing up, in a single phrase, the devastation that the plausible evidence presented in this proceeding forecasts for the children. As Australian adults know their country, Australia will be lost and the world as we know it is gone as well. The physical environment will be harsher, far more extreme and devastatingly brutal when angry. As for the human experience, quality of life, opportunities to partake in nature's treasures, the capacity to grow and prosper, all will be greatly diminished. Lives will be cut short, trauma will be far more common, and good health harder to hold and maintain. None of this will be the fault of nature itself. It will largely be inflicted by the inaction of this generation of adults in what might fairly be described as the greatest intergenerational injustice ever inflicted by one generation of humans upon the next. To say that the children are vulnerable is to understate their predicament. Now, that really gets to the heart of the issue here, in the way that we're all implicated in this. And you're quite right, Gail. Our planet Papatūānuku would be better off without us on it. So it is a real and we've had moves. I mean, Indigenous peoples have been arguing to be much more vigilant and mindful in terms of how we are domesticating and exploiting Papatūānuku, but largely our voices have gone unheard, invisibilized. But yeah, we're at a critical moment in terms of our history and how what it means for children. So I just wanted to echo those sentiments. So important.
And if I may, sorry, go ahead, Veronica?
No, go, Irfan. Go.
Okay. I was going to link that idea of how at times the policies and the practice are doing sort of a lip service in terms of addressing the pressing issues and take up a really tokenistic perspective of, for example, if we look at the planet, if we understand this sustainability, and there's this always, for example, in Australia, that 1 week of highlighting, say, the idea of reconciliation, or highlighting a week for, or even a day for Harmony Day, where in school the children would dress up in their own cultural costumes. And so that tokenistic approach to create this quick visible band-aid to invisible wounds, or to make the wounds or the systematic problems as invisible. So I think like addressing back to Aisha's previous question of, so where to next? What do we do about it? As a group of community that's asking critical questions, what do we do about it? And therefore that macro and micro levels of politics and how we infuse that in our everyday practice with children and families and the communities that we are in, that notion of local is going to be really important.
As I heard everyone's comments, and Gail, your question or your comment around the key issue of the future of the planet, I think that perhaps if we see a commonality, or what we are all asking as the collective here is, who are we as humans? Right? What is this human that we talk about? Whether Irfan that brings it as the construction or challenging the construction of the normal child, Marcella talking about the notions of children, trying to that we need to continue to deconstruct notions of children. Aisha, that you said that we need to attend to the child, and perhaps what I see is that we are all asking the question that the human that we have been shaping, literally shaping and creating through the process of education, is the problem that we need to face right now. Is that human that have, created this neoliberal policies, and we can go back to the writings of Sylvia Wynter and talk about and discuss that it's actually humanity is the problem. The concept of humanity that is always already colonial, always already racist, that perhaps within RECE we need to open that question of, what is this human that we talk about? And is this what we want to continue to perpetuate?
Yeah. What I found really inspiring of what you said, Veronica, in your introduction was how you kind of wanted to deconstruct the notions of an individual development and move towards collective practices and processes of development. I think that the focus on the individual child, the focus on the individual child's learning processes or motorical development or linguistic development is a part of this kind of colonial idea that takes away a lot of possibilities for children and families all over the world, where collective practices are part of the way they want to bring up their children. But then meeting this neoliberal educational system where the focus is on the individual. That's part of constructing what you're saying about like these humans that we are becoming. And I think that's something that we need. It might be like a place to start from my perspective, that we start to talk about this individualized ways of understanding the subject, and not to reduce the subject, but that it's actual to take the subject seriously and invite for the child to become even more by seeing the child also part of as a collective, as a part of a group of children, or a part of the family, or the local, and by that see how the child and children and childhoods are intertwined with what's around us, not only the human, but also the place where we are. So thank you for that, Veronica. I like that.
Marcela, you just stole the words out of my mouth, because I was going to say, sorry, exactly that. I was thinking about the individual versus the collective, and how just culturally speaking, at least coming to the US, learning about that, coming from India, thinking about how we think in a more collective way, and then coming to the US and just seeing a more individualistic approach towards education was very interesting for me. Another thing I would like to say is, I think, yes, what Veronica brought up was so important, and what should matter in early childhood, and what the pandemic has also taught us now, that we need to look more outside and look more into classrooms as not just having the four walls, but look to our nature and our environment, and just the world outside as a classroom, and how we can incorporate that into early childhood spaces. And I know that many educators are already doing this important work. And I know that this is, I think we're coming back to that. It used to be that way before, and then it became, school was institutionalized. And now I think people are realizing more that we need to be more in tune with the earth, with nature. And I know that many educators are doing that and doing that important work. So I think that could be also one of the main things we need to think about.
Yes, I think that that notion of the focus on the universalized child is very problematic, and so a lovely way to think about things in terms of how it creates a human in the being, or humans in the being, and perhaps even moving away from the notion of the child. Because I was once asked, what is the Māori worldview, underpinning the child? And I said, well, children from a Māori worldview is actually an oxymoron. It's just children weren't so segmented out, and in that, it still seems to be very much a behaviourist ideology underpinning those notions. So to really look deeply within that notion of what it means to be human in being with Papatūānuku and all of our cosmological sphere is quite, it's very important that we start to, they're very important aspects to focus on in terms of children, dare I say it, and their families.
I teach this course called The History of Childhood, and the first thing I go after is the idea of childhood being a cultural and social and historical invention, and also the notion of childhood innocence and so on. And many of my students seem to think that if we don't have this idea of the child, then children won't be protected. But of course, the colonial lie in that is that children are being protected. It's the construction of a particular notion of which children's lives are worth protecting. And it seems to me that the pandemic, among many, many other things, has once again given lie to that idea. because just the distribution of for example, distribution of vaccinations gives lie to the idea of lives being valued equally. So I am interested, Mary, and relating what you just said to what other people are saying. This idea that the notion of the child is so laden with these ideologies that it's causing us not to be able to. But is it causing us not to be able to think more globally about which children's lives count?
Yes. Yes, and that's why it's really important to be, critically vigilant, because they're so deep rooted in it. It is hard to, set a lot of these notions aside. But in terms of how that, just in our particular context where we're at, the notion of that universal, like we've just gone into a phase of 90% for all of our district health boards, and then we're going to move into a traffic light system around COVID, and it really does mask the realities of a lot of people's lives. And I got a sense of dread over that, and it's like Māori now are being scapegoated into thinking that this COVID problem is a Māori problem, underpinning some of the current discourses around all of this, and so in so many ways, the insidiousness of colonialism and racism and linguicism infiltrate and are hard to unpack because they're so invasive. And that's the need to be ever vigilant in whatever question. Absolutely everything is more paramount now more than ever before. But how is it all playing out in the various other localities that we're all in at the moment? I mean, let's give the rako kōrero to somebody else on the panel.
I think I'll follow up on this. What I would see them as this loose dots that are sort of floating around, in the sense of how we see the dots in groups. So for example, the dots could include the ideal child, the universal child, the individualized child, the good child, the normal child, the happy child, or the child as a learner. So for me, when I see this notion of individual versus this dichotomy of normal versus abnormal, and collective versus individual, and the ways that we talk about children, the way we construct our understandings surrounding what to teach and how children should learn, is taking and is constantly pushing for this drive to perform. So once we fall into that kind of trap of thinking about learners, children as students, then we take away that family connections and that community connections, and therefore we sort of deculture it or sort of desynthesize it to become this cultural free or this universal child. No matter whose child we are teaching, we can ensure by the end of, I don't know, say, for example, by the end of the kindergarten year, they will be able to meet that learning outcome. And if we meet that learning outcome, we are successful teachers. We have a successful classrooms. Our classroom management skills are on the top. And so it goes on, and it goes back to this idea of asking critical questions and then unpacking that tokenistic way of thinking, what should we be learning? And the things that we've learned from our past experience are so rooted in colonial ways of this child-adult, that power relations, so that we get to decide and we know what's the best for the children, and therefore we are shaping futures. In fact, we are living in yesterdays. So I think for me is that need to interject interruptions to that linear conceptualization of moving from being to becoming, and therefore thinking about that complexities of our everyday practice in the classrooms and in our communities as well.
Yeah, and yeah, thank you, Yifang. And I think what we need to talk more about how can the role of the teachers and the researchers and how RECE can be a part of this. Because for me, RECE has been a way of actually being encouraged to be brave, being encouraged to ask the questions that aren't necessarily welcome because they challenge power hierarchies or the challenge what we take for granted or the challenge the normal practices that like work really well. So that we need, and I think that RECE can take a part in building these strong and brave cultures between teachers. And I just want to say something that Jeanette, my supervisor, what she kind of taught us as a group, as students in Norway, coming up from non-academic everyday life, coming into being students and being taken seriously and invited in to share our thoughts and actually make things happen and make changes. And I remember that we wanted to give her a gift because she invited us regularly to her to have discussions around issues and literature. And we wanted to give her a gift. And then she said, I don't want you to give me gifts because I have everything that I need. But I want you to do what will be your gift to me is that you will do what I'm doing for you today. You will do that to another student when you are in a position where you actually can invite people in to be brave and to contribute. And I think as a community, that's something that we as researchers should do. To ask these critical questions and invite our students, coming early childhood teachers and researchers into these perspectives and challenge them, play with them, support them when they're finding their voice to speak up on behalf of children, and inviting them into these events like this, so that we actually can build and support each other in being brave, because it can be scary and hard, but it's so important that we don't have we can't give ourselves a privilege just to be quiet. We have to actually speak up. So I think that's an important role that RECE has and that we should all bring with us into further discussions.
Thank you, Marcella. I just wanted to add that, yes, we're talking about the universal child, the child as a student, the child as so many things that we want the child to be, but also thinking about the universal teacher and what it means to be a good teacher to those children and what we're doing, what we're expecting from them, and where does it stem from. So I feel like just thinking one step back, one step in front, and just thinking about teachers also as a part of the problem and the solution. What does it mean to be the problem and the solution? Yeah.
I'll just piggyback on what Isha noted, and perhaps we might be at a point that we need to ask more than the question of how we deconstruct the normal child or the ideal child to reimagine who might the human or the child, like Mary said, who might the human be? Could that be what RECE does in the next 30 years? What is that child that we actually dream of? Because the problem is the term child itself. And if education is about change and transformation, which it should be, then perhaps that is our role, right? And reimagination of what the human might be, and thinking, not just thinking theoretically, but also thinking pedagogically and curricularly about how might we create that kind of humanity that we need to live within the many, many challenges and life-threatening challenges that we are facing today, and leave that human that is always already racialized, always already based on colonial ideas behind or aside or somewhere else.
Marcella, I know you brought up the concept of the glocal, which, you know, the local and the global. And I have one more question for the group. We have about 5 minutes left. And specifically, I'm thinking about, are there ways in which we can bring this idea of the global to bear in powerful, productive, life-sustaining or life-giving ways? Are there ways that has to be, that can only be done on the local level? So I'm trying to think about, are there things that we are a global, right now we are a global group. Are there things that we share and can do together globally and think about globally? And then are there things that are simply need to be taken up locally? I'm not framing that very elegantly, but I'll let it go.
Yes, it reminds me that question reminds me of when we did come together in Las Cruces, New Mexico was the year before now. It seems like forever ago when we were able to come together face to face. But I don't think I ever cried so much in an international space or in an international conference as I did at that one, because every keynote, every just focused on what was happening, for families and in those circumstances for young children, and the notion of the crossing borders and the borders that we put around our lives, and the way that we shape the child. It still reeks of behaviorism, the performativity that goes on. It still reeks of behaviorism, and ways in which we're behaving that flash in various, well, around the globe actually, because colonialism has hit everywhere. And so I think that was those kinds of coming together and unpacking what's happening in local spaces and how we can come together in those global spaces to think about reframing, to challenge ourselves, to challenge the power hierarchies that you spoke of, Marcella, and really important. And at that time, I remember speaking about the state violence that was being perpetrated here towards our children. So in Oranga Tamariki, and how when, if along with the fixed notion of a child, we have a fixed notion of a family. And if you happen to be a Maori mum that doesn't have a husband, you're a sitting duck for the authorities to come in and just uplift your children. And we know that a lot of our children that have gone into state care, they're abused in those spaces. So along with the notion of, the universal child and the good child, we have notions of the opposite, bad child. And that's always, our lot that are being framed in that sort of way. So to really look at the insidiousness of colonialism that's shaped the way we're moving, and we have moved and we continue to move, and how that shapes our own behaviours is a real, that comes into sharp relief when we gather in these kinds of forums and within the global space to really be able to think clearly about what's happening in our own spaces, because that universalised child, comes down to the what's happening at the local level as well, of course. But yes, in terms of how are we harming our children? How are we harming papatuanuku? These are some of the common concerns, I think, that we continue to identify when we come together in these spaces.
Thank you, Mary.
I'm very much, sorry.
No, please.
I very much like that question and the global local that Marcela, you brought up, and with the help of Donna Haraway, I've been working with early childhood educators to think, rather than thinking about global local relations, thinking about worldly relations of the world, right? That in which we cannot avoid thinking about how I am connected here in South America to Australia with eucalyptus everywhere through colonial transportation, and how I am connected to Canada through immigration, right? Like thinking about how, if we think of ourselves as being off the world, we are always already thinking about the global and the local, because they are deeply enmeshed.
So thank you. It's 5:01 here. It's not there, but it's time now to turn to our audience questions. I think the cameras are going to be turned on for the audience. I think we're getting out of this view. Is that right? I guess Lacey might need to tell us. But regardless, I will just call. I know people have written their questions in the Q&A, but I am going to call on you to name your questions to our panelists.